let's go quickly live to the UN as the Assembly readies to vote on the resolution necessary to end the U.S. blockade against Cuba.
A/AD/L6, please signify. Those against? Abstentions?
The Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/AD/L6 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Will all delegations confirm that the votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 165,
support on the draft resolution with 165 votes in favor, 12 abstentions, 7 against. So that way the United General Assembly has adopted again for the 34th year consecutively overwhelmingly the resolution on the necessity to end the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. This is another important victory as announced by the foreign minister of Cuba. He was saying yesterday in a special interview with teleSUR that it was expected that once more Cuba was going to obtain an important victory in this the most important international arena at the UN General Assembly, as we saw 165 votes in favor, 12 abstentions, 7 against. This is the 34th time in a row since the vote has been taking place on this important draft resolution that Cuba achieves this important milestone, this important victory. And as in previous occasions, the international community, the vast majority of the international community, once again raise their voices to express their support for Cuba, the support for the Cuban people, and to call for the immediate unconditional end of the U.S. blockade against Cuba, which directly impacts the nation's development and its actions towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. As has been denounced by all the speakers, right now we're seeing other speakers addressing the UN General Assembly, explaining why they voted, explaining their vote. But as we have heard so far at the General Assembly in these 2 days of discussion, the overwhelming majority, I'm going to repeat again, 165 votes in favor, 12 abstentions, and 7 against, have called for the end of this coercive policy that has been implemented against Cuba for more than 6 decades. So we continue to follow up what is happening at the United Nations. Before the voting took place, we were listening to the Foreign Minister of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez, presenting the report and the draft resolution to which the international community overwhelmingly approved. As we were saying, 165 votes in favor, only 7 against with 12 abstentions. The Cuban foreign minister referred to all the important impact that this coercive genocidal policy has on the Cuban people. He was referring to the fact that Cuba, due to this policy and the unilateral arbitrary inclusion of the island on the list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism, Cuba has been deprived of banking systems and financing systems for its different social programs and development programs. Without having access to this banking system, it really makes it difficult for the Caribbean island to access international market and be able to purchase normally or all the resources and materials needed and food needed, as well as the financing impact that it has for the development of different projects for a developing nation as Cuba to develop its economy and continue on the path of prosperity towards reaching its different development goals and reaching the SDGs by 2030. The foreign minister also referred to the fact of the real purpose that is behind the blockade, the real reason of the blockade, a policy that the U.S. disregards and claims it does not exist, but is enshrined in its laws approved by Congress. The blockade has a clear objective, which is to break down Cuban society and therefore trigger a social outburst and to be able to carry out the real objective that the U.S. has behind this policy, which is to trigger a regime change and destroy the constitutional order. Unfortunately, also the blockade has had important impacts in fields that Cuba had already achieved important victories in its different indicators. For example, he provided the example of health indicators with a clear example where Cuba has had for years numbers that rivaled those of first world countries, the so-called first world countries, industrialized countries. And for example, in health indicators, the infant mortality went from 5, which used to be 5 per 1,000 births. It has risen to 8.5 this year per 1,000 births due to the, as we were saying, the lack of access to those international markets and the lack of access to those raw materials for the production of medicine and for the acquisition of medical equipment necessary to treat different illnesses and medical situations that arises. He was referring also to the mother's mortality rate, to the different rates in health indicators. He provided clear examples of how the blockade directly impacts Cuban patients in different hospitals. He was referring to also the important impact in the economy of the material damage that the blockade has caused only in this last year from March 2024 to February 2025, which amounts to $7.5 billion in material damage and of course the suffering that this triggers on the Cuban people, because those $7.5 billion in material damage go around through all different sectors. It goes from transportation, from the serious energy crisis that the country is experiencing right now, through relief efforts. For example, right now as Melissa is going through Cuba, or it directly impacts the relief efforts, the recovery efforts that come after different natural disasters. And right now Cuba is experiencing and just experienced the passage of a powerful hurricane, which was Melissa in the east. It also referred, as we were saying, to the fact that the United States has proven its hypocrisy in the fact that it claims that Cuba is the nation that sponsors terrorism, but he referred that just last year the Cuban government provided the United States government with a clear list of 60 names of terrorist actors that work within 20 organizations that operate in U.S. soil and directly attack the Cuban sovereignty, the Cuban economy, and the Cuban people. And so far, the United States has done nothing. No response has been provided in the fight against terrorism on that aspect. He also denounced for the first time, the foreign minister, Bruno Rodriguez, for the first time at the UN General Assembly, denounced the new economic terrorist actors, which are at times the employment by secret services, by the intelligence services of the United States, of Cuban nationals living in the U.S. and in other countries to create a speculation in Cuba, especially in the exchange rate of within the nation, which of course directly impacts the increase in prices and creates, in a way, fear for the instability, and it makes it difficult for Cuban families to access the basic products due to this increased speculation in the exchange rates that is currently existing.
Madam President, Sri Lanka aligns itself with the statements delivered by Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement and Iraq.
As we were saying, we just witnessed the vote on the resolution necessary to end the economic, financial, and commercial blockade imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. And once more, the international community responded with a clear message on the need to end this coercive policy, which was voted in favor. 165 countries voted in favor, with 7 only voting against and 12 abstentions. A new resounding victory for Cuban diplomacy, Cuban diplomacy in this scenario of the United Nations General Assembly. In a moment, I will have the names of the nations that voted against. As always, Israel and the United States, which has always been the ones voting against this draft resolution. But also this year we have the addition of Argentina, of Hungary, and 3 other nations I will briefly mention, which voted against the draft resolution. And of course, these nations which completely support the U.S. government in its repressive genocidal actions with the implementation of the current government, because we must remember this, the current government that exists in these countries, because just last year in the voting only 2 countries voted against, which were the United States and Israel both. As we know, with the change of government in Argentina and Hungary and these other nations, in this occasion they voted against, but it still is it's not even a minority. It's a very, very small number when you compare to the 165 nations that voted in favor of this draft resolution, in favor of Cuban sovereignty, of Cuban right to their own development and to the self-determination. There were 12 abstentions on this occasion, and we must recall the denunciations made by the foreign minister in just over a week ago in a press conference here in Cuba, and he did so again today during his address at the UN General Assembly, that this year the United States government has deployed a very aggressive pressure policy in the diplomatic field, especially against nations in Europe, Africans, and Asia, to pressure them and in a way almost blackmail them to change their position on how they would vote, and also threaten them with sanctions if they maintain their vote that these different nations had traditionally maintained in this voting that, as we have been saying, has been taking place since the year 1992 at the UN General Assembly. So 34 years now, 33rd times now has been this vote carried out, and for the 34th occasion it has been approved by the vast majority, by the overwhelming majority of the international community. 165 votes in favor, 12 abstentions, and 7 against. Within the 7 against, we were saying the usual actors: the United States, Israel. In this case, now with the Milei administration, Argentina, which also joins on voting against, due to this, as we know, the close ties that the Argentine government currently of the administration of Milei has with the Donald Trump administration. Right now, what is happening at the United Nations General Assembly, as we are seeing the images, is different other speakers over member states that did not speak during the debate process that we have been following up here live at teleSUR English on yesterday and today, Tuesday 28th and Wednesday 29th. They are providing their reason why they voted the way they voted. They are providing the reason, and as we have heard both from the speakers that have taken to the stand in these 2 days, and also as I've heard some of the speakers that have been addressing from their seat the reason why they voted, we continue to hear overwhelmingly that it is important for the Cuban families, for the Cuban people, that this genocidal policy that has been implemented for the last 6 decades comes to a final end, and to be able to provide the Cuban citizens the opportunity to achieve their development goals, as it is clear and evident, has been provided with figures, numbers, and facts by Cuban authorities and by numerous international organizations and different movements, the direct impact that the blockade has on the Cuban economy, on the Cuban society, on Cuban families. Let's go over again just to recall how the voting took place, how it ended, and it was with an outstanding 165 votes in favor, with 12 abstentions and 7 nations that voted against. I'm going to see for a moment if I can have the names, because when you see it on the screen, the letters are really small, so it's very difficult to read which countries abstained and which one voted against. But against, we know, I can tell you now that it was the United States, Israel, and Argentina, as well as Hungary, who voted against. And in a moment, I'll try to get the names of the ones that abstained, which were 12 with 165, which were, and in favor were, as we were saying, the great majority with 165. I have here the list. So those that voted against, as we were saying, the usual actors, Israel and the United States, which have always voted that way. We have also, in this occasion this year, we have Argentina, Hungary, North Macedonia, Paraguay, and Ukraine. Those 7 nations were the ones that voted against the draft resolution on the necessity to end the commercial, financial blockade imposed by the United States against Cuba. And 12 nations abstained, as we were saying. Those that abstained were Albania, Bosnia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Estonia, Lithuania, Morocco, Moldavia, Romania, and Poland were the ones that abstained. The 12 nations that abstained in this case, and let's quickly recall that the foreign minister has denounced in several occasions in the past weeks the strong diplomatic aggressive letters that were sent, the way that he described it. I'm paraphrasing a bit. They were very aggressive. There were 2 letters that were sent to numerous countries, both in Europe, Africa, and Asia, pretty much threatening sovereign nations to change their traditional position on the way they voted, and even threatening them with sanctions and with tariffs, which has been a common practice of the Trump administration in this second time around at the White House, and has imposed on the world in general a tariff war, putting tariffs on almost every country in the world, and putting even harsher tariffs on countries that do not align with the policies and hegemonic intentions of the U.S. empire. And even so, this aggressive diplomatic action that has been denounced by the Cuban foreign ministry, by the Cuban foreign minister Bruno Rodriguez, we see it still there was an increase in the number, a small increase in the number of abstentions compared to last year. But even so, the international community was steadfast and clear on voting in support of Cuba, in support of the Cuban people, and voting in favor of the draft resolution on the necessity to end the commercial, financial U.S. blockade against Cuba.
Have all heard.
Let's listen to some of the statements of the Nicaraguan permanent representative after his voting.
Grateful expressions and expressions of solidarity towards Cuba over the past 2 days came especially from the representatives of the biggest, most significant groups that we participate in and belong to in the United Nations, such as the statement by Iraq on behalf of the G77 and China, Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement, Turkey on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Barbados on behalf of CARICOM, Guinea-Bissau on behalf of the African Group, Singapore on behalf of ASEAN, and Eritrea on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations. The denunciation of this blockade against Cuba is universal. Only the country that applies it, the United States, was the only country that tried to justify its own anachronistic policy. As has been said throughout this debate, it is clear that there is universal support for Cuba from the entire world, and also it is clear that this criminal blockade is, in and of itself, the most serious systematic and flagrant violation of the human rights of the Cuban people. Moreover, it was made plain that there is a total rejection by countries of Cuba's inclusion on the illegal and unilateral list of state sponsors of terrorism. Nicaragua voted in favor of the resolution just adopted, and in so doing reaffirms its unshakable solidarity with the heroic Cuban Revolution, with its government and its people that are an example of dignity, resistance, and international solidarity. We reiterate that the only legitimate path is respectful dialogue on the basis of sovereign equality without conditions nor threats. Madam President, lastly, we would like to express our full solidarity with the peoples of our great Caribbean, Jamaica, Cuba, Haiti, and other Caribbean states that, as we speak, are facing the disastrous consequences of the weather phenomenon Hurricane Melissa. We express our condolences to the families and governments over the loss of life. These increasingly frequent and extreme tragedies are the consequences of global warming and the climate crisis, which has been accelerated by the failure to comply with legally binding commitments made by developed countries under the United Nations Framework Convention and also the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. The failure to comply with that by developed countries makes these phenomena increasingly disastrous in the Greater Caribbean. Thank you very much.
I thank the Speaker of Nicaragua. Now give the floor to the Speaker of Israel, followed by Ukraine and Peru.
Well, as we continue to see what just happened at the UN General Assembly with the voting on the resolution against the blockade, we continue to see. Let's recall very quickly how the voting ended with 165 votes in favor, 12 abstention, and 7 against. Go very quickly. Those that abstained were Albania, Bosnia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Estonia, Lithuania, Morocco, Moldova, Romania, and Poland. Those were the 12 nations that abstained, and the 7 nations that voted against were Argentina, Hungary, North Macedonia, Paraguay, Ukraine, and as always, Israel and the United States of America were the 7 that voted against. But we have to stay with the number 165, which represents the vast majority of the international community at this, the most important international scenario for diplomacy. And once again, the international community voted with Cuba, voted in favor of the Cuban people, and voted on the necessity to end this genocidal policy of blockade that has been imposed by the United States against the Caribbean island, a sovereign Caribbean island, for over the last 6 decades, and that directly impacts the development of the island and directly impacts and harms the Cuban families in their aspirations for development and prosperity. In this occasion, as in other occasions, the Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez, who presented the report to the General Assembly ahead of the voting that took place, the statements that we had live here on the screen, he once more reiterated the figures, the impact that this policy has, and he also denounced the hypocrisy of the United States government, the fact that the United States claims that the blockade does not exist, that it is just a pretext made up by the Cuban government, the fact that it is actually in the U.S. laws, the objective and the reason why said policy is being established, and U.S. law clearly establishes that the objective is to suffocate the Cuban economy and to bring harm and despair on the Cuban people, to force them to a social outburst, and therefore force the constitutional order to break down in the Caribbean island. This is established in U.S. laws, in U.S. official documents, which is the reason behind the blockade, the real reason behind the blockade, which is to trigger a regime change in the Caribbean island, because as has been a tradition throughout U.S. history, to topple governments, especially in this side of the world, in Latin America and the Caribbean, that do not align with a policy of submission towards the United States, that against countries that want to be sovereign, that want to be independent, and want to follow their own path and established by international law and the UN Charter. They want to be able to have their right to self-determination, and this is something a common practice, unfortunately, that happens with nations like Cuba, which is the main topic today, but also that we see that in nations like Nicaragua, Venezuela, and other governments that do not align with the U.S. policies and with the practices that the U.S. want them to have, which is pretty much being the backyard of the United States and being a sort of a new model of colony, of a neo-colonial model. These nations, peoples, and governments are the victims of these types of actions, which right now, which was also a topic on the address of the foreign minister of Cuba, which, according to the United States, they justify all these actions because they claim that Cuba, an island nation, a developing nation, is somehow a threat for the national security of the United States, is somehow a source of danger for the United States, as a nation. And the foreign minister expressed and denounced the hypocrisy of these statements by asking clear questions, which were like, who is currently right now the country that is destabilizing the region, that is destabilizing the Caribbean with a very strong military deployment in the Caribbean and threatening the stability of the region and imminent aggression against, and threats of imminent aggression against Venezuela and other nations in the south, because as we know, an aggression of Venezuela would not end there. It would have dire repercussions in the entire hemisphere. And it is clear who is the aggressor in the Caribbean, and it is clear who is the aggressor in the region, and who triggers, as he also pointed out, who is the main accomplice of the Israeli regime in its ongoing genocide that, as we know, despite that this ceasefire came into effect just over some weeks ago, just yesterday the Israeli regime continued its airstrikes, killing over 100 people in its latest attacks on Gaza. So we continue to see who are really the aggressors and who are bringing the world to a point of high instability and who is committing all these atrocious acts. So he denounced the hypocrisy of the United States on that aspect. And as it once was said at this forum, in this international arena, if the United States is committed to continue saying that it's just an excuse, a pretext, I recall that it was once said that it would be so easy to take away that excuse, to take away the pretext, and then see what happens. If the United States truly believes that the blockade does not exist, that it's just an excuse for the mismanagement of the Cuban government of the economy, it would be easier to prove their point if they simply remove the excuse. What would be the excuse then if the blockade do not exist? But as we know, and as they know, it is not an excuse, it's a real action that impacts the Cuban economy, and that is why they are not going to remove it, because they know, even though they claim they don't, they know the real impact it has, and it is the real objective, it is the real purpose that they want to achieve, especially now with an administration that is strongly supported and has a strong support in Florida with the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who has a long history of trying to bring down the Cuban economy and the Cuban government. We are joined by Ermelinda Malcott, an internationalist. She's joining us right now in this special broadcast to talk more on the importance of what we just witnessed today on this victory of Cuban diplomacy at the United General Election. Let's welcome Ermelinda Malcott. Welcome, Ermelinda.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to speak about such an important subject.
You know, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. And Merlinda, we just saw the vote, 165 votes in favor, 12 abstentions, 7 against. Tell us, what is the importance, what is the impact of this diplomatic victory that Cuba just achieved at the United Nations General Assembly?
Well, it's at the same time a great victory, and this, because of course we can see how efficient and well received is the Cuban diplomacy, and that diplomacy is a solidarity diplomacy. So we see that Cuba has always friends in the world that will always, I mean, it has been decades since in the United Nations votation are highly in favor of Cuba, and it's also in recognition of the illegality of the blockade against Cuba. So this is very huge achievement. And on the other hand, of course, it has been decades that the same vote has been occurring in the United Nations. So we know that it's not sufficient to end the blockade, but still it is a very great diplomatic victory, and it really expressed the fact that Cuba has the support of a lot of countries, but we need to do more to end the blockade, unfortunately.
You were saying we need to do more. What needs to happen in the world, in the international community, for the United States finally hearing what the international community demands from them and brings an end to this unjust policy of blockade?
Well, I think that United States will never hear that question until they really have some kind of revolution, because it's impossible for them to hear that. So what would change the situation for the blockade, what would end the blockade, is the fact that the multipolar world would develop and would be such an important institutions that the blockade would not be that much important for Cuba. I think that is the main thing. When we remember when Cuba was integrated into the Comecon, which is the common market of the Soviet Union, Cuba has a very high development. Blockade was active and they were under lots of sanctions, but the Comecon made that Cuba had a huge economic growth. They had developments in all kind of fields, and it was very, very good for Cuba. So really the question is not will United States understand that they have to stop the blockade, because they would never, because they're an imperialist country, and until that changes they would not listen to it. But we have to point out that the multipolar world that is developing will be something that would
Merlin,
not
I'm sorry
end the
to cut you
blockade,
short, but we have to go to the UN because the Cuban delegation is offering statements after the vote.
Peace that they threaten with their irresponsible military deployment in the Caribbean Sea, so as to provoke suffering on the Cuban people. They are even able to ensure reiterated cynicism within this United States. With full cynicism, they divert attention from the comprehensive efforts of their suffocation policy. No one can be in doubt of the ability of the United States to strike the economic stability of any country. This is currently being made clear through the imposition of tariffs on numerous countries around the world. In our case, these have been applied for more than 60 years. Madam President, the unjustified permanent presence of Cuba in the unilateral fraudulent list of state sponsors of terrorism is a measure geared towards strengthening the highest pressure policy against our people. Everybody knows, including U.S. security agencies, that Cuba does not sponsor terrorism, and that on the contrary, we have been the victim of this scourge, in particular from what is financed, organized, and protected from the United States territory. The United States deliberately is twisting the situation of human rights in Cuba. There is no more flagrant, massive, systematic violation than the blockade by the United States on Cuba. The United States has no moral authority to give us lectures on human rights to Cuba or anyone else. The government of that country is responsible for extrajudicial executions, abductions, and torture. They detain immigrants, they censor media and journalists. This is the country with a serious problem of public safety, violence and police brutality. During the current US administration, we have seen an exacerbation of widespread detentions, systematic violations of human rights, xenophobia, racism against other phenomena. These are alarming practices which undermine any attempt by the US government to present itself as some kind of example in human rights. They understand how the restriction on the trade between the US and Cuba happens, if we could call it that. If the United States is truly interested in trading with Cuba, they would listen the majority of citizens in their state, in their country, which supports the lifting of the blockade, and would. This is what is justice and reason would tell us to do. Madam President, the government of the United States clearly is lying when accusing Cuba of being involved in people trafficking. We know that this is a narrative, that it is a pretext continuing to support the blockade against Cuba. In holding up Cuban medical support with blackmail against countries that receive such aid, the US is jeopardizing access for hundreds of thousands of people to quality healthcare. Madam President, I would like to make it very clear that Cuba does not form part of the armed conflict in Ukraine or in any other country. The Cuban government is aware that Cuban nationals, in unprecise figures, have on their own account participated in the military operation on both sides of this conflict. None of these nationals have the consent, the motivation, or any commitment from the Cuban government to participate in that conflict. Madam President, the United States government has no ethicals or scruples or commitment to the truth in order to achieve its strategic interests. In their statement, there is no argument that enjoys the recognition of the international community. They prefer to remain isolated, as they have once again in this assembly, subject to the discredit of the blockade for more than 60 years, rather than accepting their failure in trying to destroy the Cuban Revolution. In light of the attempts to slander and destroy the Cuban Revolution, the people and government of Cuba will stand steadfast in their unwavering decision to continue forging an increasingly inclusive and prosperous society. Thank you.
I thank the
listening
speaker.
to the statements of the Cuban representation at the UN General Assembly following the votes, continue on the denunciation of the impact of the blockade against Cuba. Let's continue speaking with Ermelina Melchor, who is sharing with us her ideas on this important victory. So, Ermelina, I wanted to ask you, we heard the Foreign Minister, Bruno Rodriguez, denounce the real purpose behind why this policy really exists, which is pretty much to bring about suffering to the people, to force people out of that suffering to a social outburst, and therefore bringing down the constitutional order and forcing a regime change that is not being asked for by the Cuban people. So what can you tell us, seeing this project from this perspective?
Well, yes, it has been exactly the objective of the blockade. It has been expressed as make the Cuban people hunger and desperate, and hoping that it will bring what they call a regime change or a counter-revolution in Cuba. And it has to be stressed that if you look, for example, at Iraq, Iraq has been subject to very high sanctions, and which resulted in the death of 5,000 people each year, so half a million persons. If it has not been the case in Cuba that so many people died as they did in Iraq, is because Cuba has dedicated its whole state and government has been dedicated to help the people. It's a social state, it's a socialist state, so the public services have always been here for alleviate the sanctions and the blockade for the population. So this is how the Cuban government has always worked, is to make people suffer the less possible from the sanction, but the objective of the blockade was to make people hunger and desperate. So this is completely the objective. And as the ambassador of the United Nations from Cuba has expressed, we have reached now a situation where infantile mortality has raised in Cuba. Lots of health indicators in Cuba are on the same level of health indicator of highly developed countries like European countries. But now the blockade is so strong and so difficult for the Cuban population that yes, we have seen some of those indicators of infantile mortality raising up, which is very dramatic, but still the United States has never reached the objective they have, which is regime change, because people don't want to be subjected to what the United States wants for Cuba, which is going back to the Batista period exactly. So people doesn't want that.
Thank you very much, Marlena, for always sharing your inputs with her and for having time to speak with us here in teleSUR English.
Well, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
It's always our pleasure, as we were saying. Well, like this, we're closing this special broadcast on this important day for the Cuban diplomacy, this outstanding victory, overwhelming victory of Cuban diplomacy at the UN General Assembly. Recall 165 nations voted in favor of the draft resolution on the necessity to end the commercial blockade that is imposed by the United States of America against Cuba, that has been imposed for over 6 decades and harms directly the Cuban people and the Cuban dreams of and expectations for development and to achieving their self-determination. Let's close now. We'll have more in upcoming news briefs, so stay tuned with teleSUR English.